It's been more than a year now since Barack Obama took the oath of office as the 43rd President of the United States. For many, a victorious campaign based on hope has turned into impatience, even despair, as many of the problems born of the last decade of Republican rule in Congress persist. The injustices of the national security state still go unaddressed, and the promise of bold new initiatives for the betterment of all have stalled in Congress or have been so watered down that their original strength of purpose is all but gone. So what went wrong? In her book, Getting a Grip 2, Clarity, Creativity, and Courage for the World We Really Want, Frances Moore Lappé suggests that at the root of the problem is a concept she calls thin democracy.
It's what we have now, and it's based on this false notion of human nature that, we're so selfish and greedy and materialistic that we have to turn over our fate to other people and a magical market that's going to sort things out for us. And so we end up with a thin democracy that is really the product of an economy that's driven by one rule, highest return to people who already have the wealth, and then it infects our political system. As we see today, there are more than 24 lobbyists in Washington, most of them serving the interest of corporations, for every one person that you and I elect to represent us. That is thin democracy because it is not listening to the voters, the citizens of our country, but to private wealth. So it's private interest over public decision-making. That is thin democracy, and it's getting thinner and thinner.
There does seem to be a disconnect between people's perception of government as something outside themselves and the whole idea of democracy. And it just seems to be reinforced all the time by things like the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus FCC and the corporate power in Washington. How did this come about, and how can we reverse it?
Well, there were many times in American history where we believed that government, and we felt the changes that government could bring about. For example, during the 60s, we reduced the poverty rate in this country by half, and many people joined the Peace Corps, and they volunteered to work in anti-poverty efforts, and it made a huge difference worldwide and here. So this disconnect between us and our government, one could name the starting point, the most recent one in many places, but I think of it as during the 80s when many Republicans put forth the idea that really politics was a battle and the goal was to just destroy the other side and that government was the enemy. The famous line by President Ronald Reagan saying the problem is the government itself. So if you start with that stance that the government is the problem, what is the government? In a democracy, it's us. It's our decision about what we want to do together to live in a thriving community. So if we see that as our enemy, that's going to bring a downward slide, and that's where we are now. And so really it's about getting our democracy back. And I talk about all sorts of solutions generated in communities all over the country. But underneath it all, at a national level, which is essential to the thriving of all of these local initiatives, is getting private power out of public decision-making. In other words, clean elections, fair elections that are publicly funded, not funded by corporations. And right now there is a bill pending that would put into law something called the Fair Elections Now Act. This would allow us to have public funding at a level that is really viable so somebody can run for office simply by getting a certain number of small donations, and then the federal purse, the public money, would kick in at 4 times whatever you were able to raise in very small private donations so that no one big donor, big corporations could determine the outcome.
I've been struck by the fact, over the last decade especially, that so many people seem to vote against their own self-interest. Is this a reflection of anger at government or simply ignorance? I mean, you point out at one point that 39% of the people thought that government should stay out of Medicare.
Right.
Which seems absurd, but apparently we have an incredibly uninformed electorate.
I just read the verbatim responses to a Gallup poll among people who were opposed to the current health care reform, and it was frightening how many of them were in that category of just spouting a soundbite without any factual basis behind it. And this is the scary part, that to me is once you have such concentrated media and fear sells and these scary soundbites sell, then people act on disinformation that is really, as you say, against their own interest. And so that's why, honestly, I'm really thrilled with the emergence of the coffee party now bringing people together. And so hopefully the coffee party wants to reach out to the Tea Party folks. And I think in conversation where we can ask each other, okay, what is that based on? What does that word mean to you when you throw around the world, oh, that's socialist? What is socialist about universal health care? Of course, in this system, it would be still very much involved with private companies. So I think the only cure for this at this point is, one, is getting money out through something like the Fair Elections Now Act, which are sitting in Congress for our support, and by engaging in conversation. Go to a coffee party gathering, talk to people, and help to fight the disinformation by face-to-face conversation.
The coffee party concept is intriguing, but so many of us have been engaged in grassroots organizing for decades and have gotten pretty discouraged. What can we do to reach the broader audience? How can we help really spread the idea that it's time to question and be informed rather than recite what Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh says on TV?
Well, I think progressives, of which I count myself, I think we need to recognize that we have fallen also for the ideas of thinking that, yes, I can support the Obama candidacy and things can fundamentally change. And I think that as long as we are falling for that idea that we're part of the problem too, I give a lot of public talks, and when I get to the point about fair elections and getting money out, the kind of energy is not there. And I say, wait a minute, don't you let your eyes glaze over. This is right at the heart of the matter. It may sound technical, but it is revolutionary, getting money out. So we've allowed this to happen, that to moving away from the idea of really bringing people together and naming what is the root of the problem. And it's not just about the wrong individual. It was not because we had President Bush in power. It is about what are the core assumptions about our human nature that lead us to believe that we can survive by turning over our fate to an economy that just continues to concentrate wealth, so that presently 1% of us control as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That we in the United States produce almost a quarter of world economic output, but half of our children will be on food stamps at some point. That is a system issue. It's not about bad people electing the wrong people. It's about the assumptions that have led to what I call thin democracy and a one-rule economy that we can reshape once we get a grip, because it must go much deeper than our version of finger-pointing.
Frances Moore Lappé is the author of Getting a Grip 2, Clarity, Creativity, and